"What is this? A toy?" The officer held up an old bronze badge, turned it over once, and laughed. "It belonged to my father," she said. "He dropped it in the gravel. Then his boot came down on it. Metal scraped against stone." Inside the diner, a 74-year-old woman gasped. An old sheriff gripped the doorframe. Nobody moved. The woman in handcuffs said nothing for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost gentle. "You have no idea what you just did." He smirked. "Sounds like a threat." "It's a fact. Facts don't need to be loud." He thought he had just arrested a drifter on a motorcycle. He had no idea he had just handcuffed a state investigator who had spent 3 months building a case against him. 10 days later, it would cost him everything. His badge, his career, his name.
The town of Millbrook wakes up slow. That is the first thing you notice if you ever pass through. No rush, no noise, just the sound of a screen door closing somewhere down the street. At 6 in the morning, the sun comes up over the wheat fields east of town. It paints the water tower gold for about 10 minutes. Then the light settles into something ordinary, something honest. Millbrook sits about 40 minutes from the interstate, close enough for truckers to stop for gas, far enough that most people just pass it by. 2,300 people live there, give or take. There is one traffic light. It blinks yellow after 9 at night. There is a church, a hardware store, a feed supply, and a small clinic that closes on Sundays. There's a diner on Main Street called Ruth's Kitchen. It has been there for 40 years. The coffee is strong, the pie is better, and the woman who runs it, Ruth Callahan, knows almost everyone by name. She is 74 years old. Her hands shake a little now when she pours coffee, but her eyes do not miss a thing. On this particular Tuesday morning, Ruth was wiping down the counter when she heard the sound. A low engine, steady, coming from the east road. She looked up through the window. A motorcycle rolled into the gravel lot outside. Old model, dark green tank, chrome, worn soft with age, the kind of bike that had clearly been loved for a long time. The rider swung one leg over, planted her boots on the ground, and pulled off her helmet. A woman, late 20s, maybe 30, blonde hair pulled back, plain leather jacket, nothing flashy. She moved like someone who was used to being alone, not lonely, just used to it. Ruth watched her walk toward the door. Something about the way the woman scanned the room before she sat down. Quick, careful, like a habit she never quite dropped. Ruth had seen that look before, a long time ago in her own husband. He used to do the same thing every time he walked into a room. He had served 2 tours before he came home and opened a hardware store on 2nd Street. He never talked about it much, but the habit stayed with him until the day he died. Ruth filed that thought away and smiled instead. "Morning, hun. Sit anywhere you like." The woman nodded. "Thank you, ma'am." She chose a booth near the window, small table, good view of the road. Ruth walked over with a menu, though most folks in Millbrook didn't need one. "You just passing through?" "Something like that," the woman said. Polite, not cold, just careful with her words. "Name's Ruth." "Maggie," the woman answered. She didn't offer a last name, and Ruth didn't ask for one. Around here, people learned that some folks carry quiet with them like a coat. You don't pull it off them. You just let them wear it. Ruth brought coffee first, black. No question asked, because the woman hadn't touched the sugar packets. Some people you can read in 5 seconds. This one, Ruth figured, would take longer. At the counter, an old man in a faded green cap sat reading the paper. His name was Walter Boone. Everybody in town called him Sheriff, though he hadn't worn a badge in 15 years. Walter had spent 11 years as a young deputy, and nearly 2 decades more after that as the town's own sheriff, once the job finally passed to him. Now he mostly fixed radios and complained about the price of gasoline. Next to him sat Frank Delaney, 81 years old, a cup of black coffee going cold in front of him. Frank had served overseas in his 20s, long before Millbrook knew his name. He rarely spoke about those years, but every morning at exactly 7:15 he stood by the flagpole outside the diner and watched it rise. Some things a man keeps private, others he keeps sacred, and you learn the difference by watching, not asking. Frank had noticed the motorcycle too. He always noticed engines, old habit. "That's a fine old machine," he said to no one in particular, nodding toward the window. Walter followed his gaze. "Triumph, looks like 1970s maybe. Somebody took good care of that," Frank said. "You can tell. Machines remember how they're treated, same as people." Ruth smiled at that, refilling both their cups without being asked. "You two old men and your engines," she said. "Some things never change around here." "Some things shouldn't," Frank said quietly and went back to his coffee. He glanced up when the bell over the door rang again, not at Maggie, at the man who walked in behind her in uniform boots too polished for a small-town patrol. Officer Cole Dawson, 35 years old, broad shoulders, a jaw he liked to keep tight like he was always posing for something. He had been on the Millbrook police force for 6 years. In that time, he had built himself a certain reputation. Some called him a go-getter. Others, the ones who didn't say it out loud, called him something else. Walter had a name for men like Dawson. He called them badge heavy, meaning the badge weighed more to them than the oath that came with it. Dawson walked past Maggie's table on his way to the counter. He slowed down, just slightly. His eyes moved over the motorcycle parked outside, then back to her. "That your bike?" Maggie looked up from her coffee. "Yes, sir." "Nice ride for somebody riding alone." He said it with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Maggie didn't answer right away. She took another sip of coffee. "Didn't figure you for the type," Dawson added, still smiling. "What type is that, officer?" He shrugged. "The type that rides something that clean without a man teaching her how?" A few heads turned. Not many, just enough. Ruth behind the counter felt her jaw tighten. She had heard Dawson talk like this before, to waitresses, to the young mothers who came in on Sundays. He had a way of saying things that sounded almost like a compliment, but never quite were. Maggie set her cup down gently. "I've had a lot of practice." "I bet you have." Dawson's smile widened, but something in his eyes had shifted. He didn't like being met with calm. Some men don't. They expect a flinch. When they don't get one, it bothers them more than any argument would. He walked out without ordering anything. Ruth watched him go, then walked over to refill Maggie's coffee, though it was still nearly full. "Don't mind him," Ruth said quietly. "He's like that with everybody who don't back down easy." Maggie gave a small nod. "I've met a few like him." "Where you headed, if you don't mind me asking?" "Nowhere in particular, just riding for a while." Ruth wanted to ask more. She always did, but something told her this woman's answers, when they came, would come on their own time. So she let it be and went back to her coffee pot. Outside through the window, Maggie watched Dawson lean against his cruiser talking on his radio. His eyes kept flicking back toward the diner. She had seen that look before, too, men deciding whether their pride was worth the trouble. She finished her coffee slowly. No rush. Whatever was about to happen, she had learned a long time ago, rushing never helped. It was 20 minutes later when she walked back outside to her motorcycle. Dawson was waiting by it, arms crossed, sunglasses on even though the morning was still soft with clouds. "This your registration?" he asked without saying good morning. "Yes." "Funny, plate's not coming up right in our system." Maggie tilted her head slightly. "That system update recently? Sometimes they lag on out-of-state transfers." You always got an excuse ready. "No, sir, just information." "Where you coming from? Does that matter for a registration check?" "It matters if I say it matters." Maggie kept her voice even. "I'm not trying to give you trouble, officer." "Funny. Trouble seems to follow women who travel alone on machines like this." "I don't think trouble follows anyone. I think some people go looking for it." Dawson's jaw tightened again. He had run the plate himself 5 minutes earlier and typed one number wrong. He would never admit that. Not to her, not to anyone. Some men, when they make a small mistake, look for someone else to blame it on. It is easier that way. At least it feels easier in the moment. "Step away from the bike," he said. Maggie didn't argue. She stepped back, hands loose at her sides, calm as still water. "I'm going to need you to put your hands where I can see them." "They are where you can see them, officer." By now, a small crowd had gathered near the diner windows. Ruth stood at the door drying a mug with a towel she had forgotten she was holding. An older couple, the Hendersons, paused on the sidewalk watching with the particular stillness of people who sense trouble but don't yet understand it. Dawson reached for his cuffs. "You're being detained for suspicion of a stolen vehicle." Maggie's eyes narrowed just slightly. Not with fear, with something closer to disappointment. "That bike belonged to my father," she said quietly. "It's registered under my name. You can check again." "I already checked." "Then check the number you typed, not the number on the plate." For half a second something flickered across Dawson's face. Doubt, maybe, but pride is a stubborn animal, and his had already dug in its heels. "Turn around." She did. No struggle, no raised voice, just the quiet sound of metal closing around her wrists. It is a strange thing watching someone accept an injustice without fighting it. Some people in the crowd felt relief, thinking it meant she was guilty. Others felt something heavier, a discomfort they couldn't quite name. Walter Boone, standing just inside the diner door, felt his old instincts stir. 11 years as a deputy and nearly 2 decades wearing the sheriff's badge himself had trained him to read a face quickly, and that training did not disappear just because he had traded the badge for a fishing rod. And what he saw in that young woman's face was not guilt. It was patience. The kind that comes from experience, not weakness. Dawson walked Maggie toward the saddlebag on the side of her motorcycle. "Let's see what you're carrying." "That's my personal property, which I have every right to inspect given the circumstances." He unzipped the leather bag without waiting for her to answer. Inside, wrapped in a soft cloth, was an old sheriff's badge, tarnished bronze, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. Engraved on the back in small letters were the words, "To protect, not to punish." Dawson picked it up, turned it over once, and laughed. "What is this, a toy?" "It belonged to my father," Maggie said. Her voice stayed level, but something in it had changed. Not anger, something closer to grief, carefully guarded. "Sentimental," Dawson said, tossing it carelessly onto the gravel. It landed face up, catching a small glint of morning light. Then, whether by accident or by something uglier, his boot came down on it as he turned. A small scraping sound. Metal against stone. Ruth gasped audibly from the doorway. Walter's hand tightened around the doorframe. Inside the diner, Frank Delaney set his coffee cup down slowly, the china clicking against the saucer. He did not go outside. His knees would not have carried him fast enough to matter. But he watched through the glass, and something in his face went very still. A badge on the ground was not just a badge to a man like Frank. It was a promise face down in the dirt under somebody's boot. He had seen disrespect before, in places far from Millbrook, and he had never once gotten used to it. "Somebody ought to say something," he murmured, mostly to himself. Nobody did. Not yet. That was the part that would stay with Frank the longest, later, when he thought back on that morning. Not the boot on the badge, the silence that followed it. Maggie's eyes dropped to the badge for just a moment, just long enough for anyone watching closely to see what it cost her to stay silent. Then she looked back up straight at Dawson and said the only thing she would say that whole morning that came close to a warning. "You have no idea what you just did." Dawson smirked. "Sounds like a threat." "It's a fact," Maggie said quietly. "Facts don't need to be loud." He didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. He hauled her toward the cruiser, one hand on her shoulder, guiding her with more force than the moment required. The crowd outside the diner had grown to a dozen people now. Nobody moved to stop him. Nobody moved to help her either. That is often how it goes in small towns and big cities alike. People wait to see which way the wind is blowing before they plant their feet. Ruth was the only one who stepped forward. "Cole," she said, using his first name the way you do when you've known someone since they were a boy mowing lawns for spare change. "This isn't right, and you know it." Dawson didn't even look at her. "Stay out of this, Ruth. I've known you since you were 12 years old, and I've got a job to do." He opened the back door of the cruiser and guided Maggie inside, one hand on top of her head, the way they do in the movies. The door shut with a heavy metallic sound that seemed to hang in the morning air a moment too long. Ruth watched the cruiser pull away, dust rising behind it on the gravel road. She looked down at the bag still lying in the dirt. Slowly, quietly, she walked over, knelt down with some effort and picked it up. She wiped it clean with the corner of her apron. To protect, not to punish. She read the words twice, then slipped the badge into her apron pocket, close to her heart, though she could not have told you exactly why. Somewhere behind her, Walter Boone had already turned and gone back inside, moving faster than a man his age usually moved. He had seen that motorcycle before. He was almost certain of it. But memory at 79 sometimes takes its time catching up with the heart. At the Millbrook Police Department, they did not have much use for a holding cell. Most nights it stayed empty, a relic from a time when the town had more trouble in it. Now it mostly held drunk drivers on Friday nights and the occasional teenager who thought fireworks were a good idea in July. That afternoon, it held Maggie Whitfield. She sat on the narrow bench, hands folded in her lap, back straight. Not the posture of someone broken, the posture of someone who had simply decided to wait. A young officer walked past the cell twice before she finally stopped. Denise Colton, 26 years old, 2 years on the force. She had joined because her uncle had been a state trooper and she had grown up believing the job meant something. Lately, that belief had been getting harder to hold on to. "You need anything, Water?" Denise asked, keeping her voice low. Maggie looked up. "No, thank you." "They're saying you resisted." "I didn't." Denise studied her for a moment. There was something in the woman's calm that didn't match the story on the arrest report. People who resist usually still carry some heat in them, even hours later. Some leftover anger in the shoulders, the jaw. Maggie had none of that. "Can I ask you something?" Denise said. "You can ask. Why didn't you fight back? Out there, I mean, when he cuffed you?" Maggie considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because fighting back would have proved him right," she said. "And I've learned that some men need to be the ones to prove themselves wrong." Denise didn't fully understand what she meant, not yet. But something in the sentence stayed with her the rest of that day like a splinter she couldn't quite locate. She walked back to her desk and found herself pulling up the arrest report Dawson had filed. Something about the plate number didn't sit right. She didn't say anything to anyone. Not yet. She just wrote the discrepancy down in a small notebook she kept in her bottom drawer, a habit her uncle had taught her. Write it down before you forget why it bothered you. By evening, the department decided to hold Maggie overnight. Captain Hank Corrigan, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and 30 years on the force, signed off on it without much discussion. Dawson had brought him a story that sounded clean enough. Suspicious vehicle, uncooperative subject, standard procedure. Corrigan liked things that sounded clean. It made his job easier. He did not like complications, and he especially did not like complications involving young officers with big reputations to protect. Dawson was in Corrigan's mind good for the department's image. Sharp uniform, good with the local paper, the kind of officer who made the 6 o'clock news look decent. Corrigan had learned over the years to let certain things slide if the man wearing the badge was useful enough. It is a common mistake, mistaking usefulness for integrity. They are not the same thing, though. From the distance, in dim light, they can look alike. That night, the cell was quiet, except for the hum of an old fluorescent light overhead. Maggie lay on the thin cot, staring up at the ceiling. She did not cry. She had done enough of that years ago, when it still helped. Instead, her mind drifted back the way it sometimes did in quiet rooms to her father. Sheriff Daniel Whitfield had been the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday in a town of 4,000 people. He always said that a badge was not a shield you hid behind, it was a promise you carried out loud every single day. He died 6 years ago, pulling a family of 4 out of a burning house on Route 9. He got the parents and 2 children out safely. He went back in for the family dog, because the little girl was screaming for it and something in him could not leave a child crying like that. The roof came down before he made it back out. Maggie was 22 years old when they told her. She remembered standing at his funeral, watching half the town come out in the rain, and thinking that grief, when it is shared by that many people, becomes something almost bearable. Almost. Her mother had died 3 years earlier from a long illness that took her slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but patience and quiet goodbyes. Maggie had learned 2 very different lessons from her parents, and she carried both of them like tools in a bag. From her mother, she learned how to sit with pain without letting it become bitterness. From her father, she learned that service was not about the size of the uniform, it was about the size of the promise underneath it. After the funeral, people in Millbrook kept telling her the same thing over and over, the way people do when they don't know what else to say. Your father would be proud of you. She never knew back then exactly what that meant. She only knew she wanted it to be true. She had joined the military not long after that, not out of anger, but out of something closer to inheritance. Her father always said that some families pass down land or businesses or old rocking chairs. Their family passed down duty. She trained in military law, became a judge advocate, an officer whose job was to make sure that even inside the strict order of the armed forces, the rules were followed, and fairness had a seat at the table. She had seen enough in those years to understand something most people never have to learn: that power without accountability rots a person slowly from the inside, long before anyone on the outside can see it. She left the military 2 years ago, not because she stopped believing in service, because she wanted to serve somewhere closer to the ground her father had walked. Small towns, ordinary people, the places where nobody was watching closely enough. Now she worked quietly, mostly unnoticed, for the state attorney general's office. Her job these days was not to prosecute crimes after they happened. It was to notice patterns before they grew into something worse. Patterns of complaints that never quite made it into a formal file. Patterns of small humiliations that added up over months and years into something that looked, from far enough away, like a system working exactly the way certain men wanted it to work. 3 months ago, a folder had crossed her desk labeled Millbrook Police Department. 7 complaints in 18 months, all involving the same officer. All involving women traveling alone. All of them somehow closed without action. She had come to Millbrook not as an investigator with a badge and a clipboard, but as a woman on a motorcycle, quiet, patient, willing to let the town show her exactly who it was. She had not expected to become part of the evidence herself. But she was not surprised, either. Men like Dawson rarely wait long to reveal themselves. They just need an audience small enough to feel safe in front of. Lying in that cell, Maggie thought of her father's badge in the pocket of a woman she had known for less than an hour. She hoped quietly that it was safe. Some objects carry more weight than their metal would suggest, not because of magic, because of memory. Down the hall, Denise Colton sat at her desk long after her shift had technically ended. She kept coming back to the plate number. She pulled up the state database herself, typed the numbers in slowly, one at a time. The registration matched. Clean, no flags, no stolen vehicle report anywhere in the system. Dawson had transposed 2 digits, a simple mistake, the kind anyone could make in a hurry. Except Dawson had not been in a hurry. He had circled that bike twice before running the plate. Denise closed the browser window and sat back in her chair. She thought about the woman in the holding cell, sitting so calm, so still, like calm was something she had built brick by brick over years. She thought about her uncle, the trooper, and the story he used to tell about the day he pulled over a senator's car by mistake. He had said the mistake wasn't the problem. The problem was what a person did after they realized it. Denise made a decision that night that she did not fully understand yet. She decided to keep watching, quietly, carefully, the way her uncle had taught her. Not because she was certain of anything, because something did not sit right, and ignoring that feeling had never once led anywhere good. Before she left for the night, she walked back to the holding cell one last time. Maggie was still awake, sitting up now, her back against the cold cinder block wall.
"Couldn't sleep either?" Denise asked.
I've slept in worse places, Maggie said with the faintest hint of a smile. Can I ask you something else? Go ahead. Why does it matter so much to you? The badge, I mean. Most people would have just let him keep it, filed a complaint later. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Because a badge isn't just metal, she finally said. It's a promise somebody made out loud in front of people who trusted them to keep it. When somebody steps on that, they're not just being rude. They're breaking something that took a long time to build. Denise nodded slowly, though she was not sure she fully understood yet. My uncle used to say something like that, she said, about the job meaning more than the paycheck. Sounds like a good man. He was. Denise hesitated at the door. For what it's worth, I don't think you did anything wrong today. I know, Maggie said simply, but thank you for saying it anyway. Denise turned off the hallway light behind her, leaving only the soft hum of the fluorescent bulb above the cell. It was a small kindness. But small kindnesses offered at the right moment have a way of changing the whole shape of a story later on. The next morning, a public defender named Grace Ashford arrived at the station a little after 8. She was 43 years old, sharp-eyed, with the kind of tired patience that came from representing people the system had already decided to write off. She had been assigned Maggie's case late the night before, one file among a stack of others. At first glance, it looked simple enough. Minor obstruction charge. Should resolve itself in a hearing within the week. But when she sat down across from Maggie in the small interview room, something about the woman's composure gave her pause. Grace had represented hundreds of clients over the years. Guilty ones who talked too much, trying to explain their way out. Innocent ones who talked too little, paralyzed by disbelief that this was happening to them at all. Maggie did neither. She answered every question directly, no more, no less. Is there anything else I should know? Grace finally asked, closing her folder. Maggie was quiet for a moment. There's more to my situation than what's in that file, but I can't tell you everything yet. Grace raised an eyebrow. That's not usually something clients say to their own lawyer. I know, I'm sorry, it's not personal. You're not a danger to anyone, are you? No, Maggie said, and something in the simple honesty of her voice made Grace believe her immediately. Grace had been a public defender for almost 18 years, long enough to develop a kind of internal alarm one that rang whenever a client's story did not quite match their eyes. Guilty people often talked too fast, filling silence because silence felt dangerous to them. Innocent people, more often than not, went quiet in a different way. Tired, almost apologetic, as if the whole misunderstanding were somehow their fault for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maggie's silence was different from both. It was not fear, and it was not guilt. It was the silence of someone carrying more information than she was allowed to share. Grace had seen that kind of silence exactly twice before in her career, once in a witness protected by federal marshals, once in a young soldier testifying about something that happened during his own service years earlier that he was still not permitted to describe in full. You've done this before, Grace said slowly. Sat across from a lawyer and said less than you know. Maggie met her eyes but did not answer. That's all right, Grace said, closing her folder. I've built a career on representing people who couldn't tell me everything. Doesn't mean I can't do my job. Thank you, Maggie said quietly. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you're out that door. She was right. By early afternoon, with no formal complaint from any actual witness willing to testify to obstruction, Maggie was released on her own recognizance. Her motorcycle, however, remained impounded pending further review. Her license was temporarily flagged, a bureaucratic inconvenience Dawson had pushed through with unusual speed. As Maggie collected her few belongings at the front desk, she noticed Walter Boone sitting on a bench near the entrance. He had been there most of the morning, though nobody had asked him to come. Old habits again. A sheriff's instincts do not retire even when the badge does. He stood slowly as she approached, leaning slightly on his cane. Miss, he said, mind if I ask you something? Maggie paused. Go ahead. That motorcycle of yours, dark green tank, old Triumph, if I'm not mistaken. That's right. I used to know a man who rode one just like it. Every single detail the same, right down to the little dent on the left side of the tank. Maggie's expression stayed calm, but something behind her eyes shifted. His name was Daniel Whitfield, Walter said quietly. Best sheriff this town ever had. Died saving a family on Route 9. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The station around them kept moving, phones ringing, someone laughing too loud near the coffee machine. But between the two of them, the world had gone very still. "He was my father," Maggie finally said. Walter's eyes filled just slightly, the way an old man's eyes do when a memory surfaces faster than he expects. "I served as his deputy for 11 years before the town ever handed me the title myself," Walter said. "Best man I ever worked for. Never raised his voice unless somebody needed protecting." That sounds like him. He used to walk the 4th of July parade on foot every year, shaking every hand along the route. Said a badge only meant something if people could see the man wearing it. Maggie felt her throat tighten. "I remember that parade. You would have been just a girl then, riding on his shoulders half the time." "I don't remember that part." "I do," Walter said, smiling faintly. He always said this town would be in good hands one day, whether he was still around to see it or not. Didn't know if he meant it as a joke or a promise. Maybe it was both. "What happened to you yesterday that would have broken his heart? Not because you were hurt, because it happened here, in his town, under a badge he used to trust." "It's not his town anymore, Mr. Boone." "No," Walter admitted. "But some of us still act like it is, still try to keep it worth the name he gave it." "You've got his eyes," Walter said. "I should have seen it yesterday. Would have saved you a night in that cell." "You couldn't have known." "Maybe not." Walter shook his head slowly. "But I know something now, and I don't intend to forget it." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small business card, worn soft at the corners. "You need anything in this town, you come find me. Understand?" Maggie took the card. "Thank you." "No," Walter said. "Thank your father. This town owes him more than it ever paid back." As Maggie stepped outside into the early afternoon light, she found Ruth Callahan waiting by the door apron, still on, as though she had walked straight from the diner without stopping to think twice. Ruth reached into her pocket and pulled out the badge. "This belongs to you," she said, placing it gently in Maggie's palm. Maggie closed her fingers around it slowly. "Thank you," she said, and her voice for the first time since the arrest carried something close to a tremor. "That man had no right," Ruth said, anger flashing briefly across her tired face. "No right at all." "I know." "You're not going to just let this go, are you?" Maggie looked down at the badge in her hand. "To protect, not to punish." "No," she said quietly. "I'm not." Ruth studied her for a long moment, the way you study someone when you sense there is more beneath the surface than they are letting on. "You're not just some woman passing through, are you, honey?" Maggie allowed herself the smallest smile. "Not exactly." "Well," Ruth said, patting her arm gently, "whatever you are, whoever you are, you come by the diner anytime. Coffee's on the house." "I appreciate that." Ruth turned to walk back toward Main Street, then paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "half this town saw what happened yesterday. Half this town looked away, but the other half didn't sleep well last night either. Sometimes that's how it starts. People remembering what they should have done." Maggie watched her walk away, apron strings trailing slightly in the afternoon breeze. She thought about her father, about the fire on Route 9, about the little girl screaming for her dog. She thought about all the ordinary people who make small, quiet choices every single day, choices nobody sees, choices that either build a town's conscience or slowly wear it away. She slipped the badge into her jacket pocket close to her chest, the way Ruth had carried it the night before. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let herself breathe. Not the breath of relief, something steadier than that. The breath of someone recommitting to a decision already made. She thought of a lesson her father had always told her, especially on nights when the job had been hard. He had always told her that the measure of a good person was not how they acted when applauded. It was how they acted when nobody was clapping, and nothing was easy, and the right thing cost something real. She had believed him as a child, the way children believe most things their fathers tell them. She believed him now as a grown woman, standing in a gravel parking lot for reasons far more complicated. Somewhere behind her, the station door opened and closed again. Ordinary sounds in an ordinary town, but Maggie had learned over the years that ordinary towns are rarely as simple as they look from the outside. Every diner has a Ruth. Every department has a Denise quietly writing things down. Every town has an old man on a bench who remembers more than anyone gives him credit for. And every system, no matter how small, has at least one person willing to protect it, even when protecting it means protecting the wrong thing. The question was never whether Millbrook had good people in it. The question was whether those good people would find their courage before the cost got too high. Behind her, through the station window, she could see Officer Denise Colton watching her from a distance, a small notebook tucked under one arm. Their eyes met for a moment. Denise gave the smallest nod, barely visible but unmistakable. Not an apology, not yet. Something closer to a promise. Maggie nodded back just once and turned toward the borrowed truck Grace had arranged to take her to the motel. She did not look back at the station. She had learned long ago that looking back too often could slow a person down when they needed steady footing most. Instead, she looked ahead toward Main Street, toward the diner sign swinging gently in the breeze, toward a town that did not yet understand what it had just witnessed. Somewhere in that town, a report would soon be filed. A phone call would soon be made to a quiet office 200 miles away, and a week that had started with a pair of handcuffs on a gravel lot was only just beginning. Maggie did not know, riding in the passenger seat of a borrowed truck toward a small motel on the edge of town, exactly how the rest of that week would unfold. She did not know that Officer Cole Dawson, sitting in his cruiser 3 blocks away, was already deciding that this quiet woman needed to be dealt with more firmly. Dawson sat with both hands on the wheel, engine idling, staring at nothing in particular. He kept replaying the moment at the diner in his mind, the way she hadn't flinched, the way she hadn't raised her voice, not once. It bothered him more than shouting would have. Shouting he knew how to handle. Shouting made him feel justified. This quiet was different. It felt like being watched by someone taking notes he couldn't see. He told himself she was hiding something, some kind of trick, some kind of angle. He did not consider even for a moment that the trick might simply be the truth, patiently waiting for the right moment to surface. Men like Dawson rarely consider that possibility. It requires a kind of humility they have not practiced in a long time. He picked up his radio and called Captain Corrigan. "That woman from yesterday," he said. "I don't think this is over. I think there's more to her than what's on paper." He meant it as a warning to himself, a reason to dig in harder. He had no idea how right he was, or how little that instinct would end up protecting him. On the other end of the radio, Captain Corrigan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had 30 years on the force, and 4 more until retirement, and he had learned to measure every decision by how much paperwork it would generate. "Just close it out clean, Dawson," he said. "Woman's out on bail, no priors, let it die down." "I don't think it's going to die down." "Make it die down," Corrigan said more firmly this time. "I don't need this department in the paper over a fender registration mix-up." It wasn't a mix-up. "I didn't ask what it was. I asked you to close it." Dawson said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "Yes, sir." Corrigan hung up the radio and sat alone in his office a while longer, staring at a framed photo on his desk of himself shaking hands with the mayor 2 years earlier. He liked that photo. He liked what it represented. A department running smoothly, no headlines, no complaints loud enough to matter. He did not think in that moment about the woman who had spent the night in his holding cell. He thought about calendars and budgets and the quiet, comfortable math of looking the other way. It is a kind of math that adds up for a while, until one day it doesn't. Miles away at the small motel on the edge of town, none of that conversation had reached Maggie yet. She sat on the edge of the bed, badge in hand, unaware of the 2 calls that had just been made about her, or the 2 very different men who had made them. She did not know that Captain Corrigan would soon be signing paperwork he would come to regret. She did not know that a phone call was already waiting for her back at the small office 200 miles away from a man named Marcus Reed, asking quietly how the assignment in Millbrook was progressing. What she did know, sitting there with her father's badge warm in her palm, was something simpler. Some things take patience to make right. Her father had taught her that in 100 small ways over 22 years. He liked to say that the loudest man in the room is rarely the strongest one in it. And dignity, he told her once, is not something anyone can take from you. It is only something you can give away if you let them convince you to. Maggie had not given hers away. Not in that diner, not in that cell, and she did not intend to start now. As the sun began to lower over Millbrook, casting long shadows across Main Street, life in the town continued as it always had. The hardware store closed at 5, the church bells rang at 6. Somewhere, a screen door slammed shut and a dog barked twice at nothing in particular. But something in the town had shifted quietly, the way weather shifts before a storm nobody has noticed yet. An old sheriff remembered a promise he thought he had already kept. A young officer began writing down things she used to overlook. A diner owner carried a badge home in her apron pocket like it was something sacred. And a woman on a borrowed motorcycle, soon to be returned to her, rode slowly through the edge of that memory, carrying with her a patience that had been tested but never broken. Whatever came next, Millbrook would not be the same town it was yesterday morning. Some places do not know they are about to change. They only know it looking back, once the change has already come. There is an old saying one Frank Delaney liked to repeat sitting at that same diner counter year after year. Respect is not loud. It just refuses to look away. Maybe that is the lesson hiding inside a morning like this one. Not in the badge or the handcuffs or the boot print left behind in the gravel, but in the small choices people make when nobody is grading them for it. Ruth choosing to pick a badge up out of the dirt. Denise choosing to write a number down in a notebook. Walter choosing to remember a face he almost let slip past him. None of them knew that evening how much those small choices would matter. That is usually how it goes in real life, far more often than in stories. The turning point rarely announces itself. It just quietly asks who was paying attention. By Wednesday night, the impound lot behind the station sat quiet, the old Triumph, parked under a single security light, chrome catching the glow like something waiting patiently to be remembered. Nobody touched it. Nobody needed to. Some things simply wait for their moment, the same patient way the woman who owned it had learned to wait years before she ever rode into a town like this one. 2 days after the arrest, Millbrook still looked the same from the outside. The same slow mornings, the same church bells at 6, the same dog barking at nothing down on Elm Street. But underneath that calm surface, something had started to shift, the way water shifts before it decides which direction to run. Officer Cole Dawson had not let go of it. That was the thing about men like him. An insult, real or imagined, did not fade with time. It sat in the chest, low and warm, until it needed somewhere to go. Dawson had grown up in Millbrook, the son of a long-haul trucker who was rarely home, and a mother who worked double shifts at the county hospital. He had joined the force at 23, hungry for the kind of respect he had never quite gotten as a boy. For a while, the uniform had given him that. People nodded when he walked into a room. People got quiet, careful, deferential. He had mistaken that carefulness for respect, when in truth it was closer to fear, and the two things, though they can look similar from a certain angle, are not the same at all. Nobody in Millbrook had ever sat him down and explained the difference. Nobody had needed to, as long as the uniform kept working the way it always had. He told himself he was simply doing his job, following a hunch, protecting the town from something it did not yet understand. In truth, he could not stop thinking about the way Maggie Whitfield had looked at him. Not with fear, with something closer to patience, the kind adults use on people who have not yet learned better. That look had followed him home. It had followed him into his sleep. And so, on Thursday morning, before his shift even started, Dawson drove out past the edge of town to the motel where Maggie was staying. He did not go in. He did not knock. He parked across the street in the shade of an old oak tree and watched. He told himself this was surveillance, professional diligence. It was, in truth, something closer to obsession, though he would never have used that word for himself. From her motel window, Maggie noticed the cruiser almost immediately. She had spent enough years reading rooms, reading people, reading the small shifts in a man's posture that told you everything you needed to know about his intentions. She did not react. She simply made a note mentally, the way she had been trained to. Patterns matter more than single moments, and a man parked across the street from a woman he had wrongfully detained 2 days earlier was undeniably a pattern beginning to form. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had not used in 3 months. It rang twice before a calm, measured voice answered. "Reed, it's Whitfield." There was a small pause on the other end. "You're supposed to check in on Fridays." "I know. Something's accelerating faster than expected." Marcus Reed did not sound surprised. He rarely did. 15 years running quiet investigations for the state attorney general's office had trained the surprise out of him. "Tell me," Maggie explained briefly without embellishment. The traffic stop, the badge, the overnight hold. The officer now parked outside her motel 2 days later for no reason he could explain if asked. "You want backup sent in?" Reed asked. "No, not yet. If this department is doing what I think it's doing, backup too early spooks them into cleaning up before we see the real pattern." "You're the one on the ground," Reed said. "Your call. But Whitfield, if this escalates into something involving your safety, that changes." "Understood. How's the file looking?" "Growing," Maggie said quietly. "Faster than I expected." She hung up the phone and looked out the window one more time. The cruiser was gone. But she knew, with the kind of certainty that came from years of watching men just like Dawson, that this was only the beginning of his attention, not the end of it. At the police station, Denise Colton had begun a habit she kept mostly to herself. Every evening after her shift ended, she stayed an extra 30 minutes reviewing old case files. She told herself it was for training, getting familiar with department procedure. In truth, she was looking for a pattern, the same way Maggie was, though neither of them yet knew the other was looking. It started with the plate number discrepancy from Tuesday. It grew when she pulled Dawson's arrest history from the past 18 months. Denise worked carefully, methodically, closing her office door most evenings so no one would ask what she was reviewing so late after her shift ended. She was not naturally a suspicious person. She had joined the force believing mostly in the good intentions of the people around her. That belief had not vanished entirely, but it had grown more careful, more willing to ask quiet questions before accepting a clean story at face value. 7 incidents stood out, all involving women traveling alone, all involving vague charges that never quite held up. All of them closed quietly without a formal review. In 4 of the 7, the arresting report was filed by Dawson alone, with no secondary officer present to confirm the details. That in itself was not unusual in a department as small as Millbrook's, but something about the pattern made Denise's stomach tighten each time she read through it. She wrote the case numbers down in her small notebook, the same one her uncle had given her the year she joined the force. On the inside cover, in her uncle's handwriting, was a short note he had written the day she graduated the academy. "The badge asks you to serve, it never asks you to look away." She read it again that night, for the first time in months, and felt something settle inside her. Quiet, but firm. She was not yet sure what she would do with what she was finding, but she knew with growing certainty that she would not simply file it away and forget it. On Thursday morning, Maggie met with Grace Ashford at a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. It was quieter there than the diner, and Grace had insisted on somewhere private. "I need you to understand something," Grace said, stirring her coffee slowly. "Cole Dawson filed an amended report this morning." "Amended? How?" "He's added a claim that you made a verbal threat during the arrest. Something about resisting with force." Maggie's expression did not change, but her voice sharpened slightly. "That never happened." "I believe you," Grace said. But belief doesn't win hearings. Evidence does. There's dashcam footage from his cruiser. There should be, Grace said carefully. According to the department's own log, that footage is currently marked as corrupted.
Maggie went very still.
Convenient. Very. Grace set down her coffee cup. I've requested the raw file be preserved before the system automatically overwrites it. Departments like this one usually run a 72-hour retention cycle on unflagged footage. How long do we have? Grace checked her watch. As of this morning, just under 60 hours.
Maggie absorbed that in silence for a moment.
I need to ask you something, Grace continued, lowering her voice. And I need an honest answer, even if it's incomplete. Go ahead. Are you connected to a state or federal office in some capacity? I've represented enough clients to recognize the way you carry yourself. It isn't civilian. Maggie considered her words carefully before answering. I served for several years as a military attorney, she said. Judge Advocate General's Corps. I left 2 years ago. Grace's eyebrows lifted slightly. That explains a few things. It doesn't explain everything. I didn't expect it to. Grace studied her for a long moment. But it tells me you understand exactly how thin the ice is that Dawson is currently standing on, legally speaking.
Falsifying an official report is not a small matter.
No, Maggie agreed. It isn't. Is there more you're not telling me? Maggie held her gaze. Yes, but it isn't mine to share yet. When it becomes relevant, you'll know everything. Grace exhaled slowly. I don't love working half-blind. I know. I'm sorry. Don't apologize.
Grace managed a tired smile.
Half-blind is still better odds than most of my clients get. Now, let's talk about what happens if that footage disappears before we can pull it. They spent the next hour going over procedure deadlines, the narrow legal path that stood between Maggie and a hearing that could end with her license suspended and a criminal charge attached to her name. Grace made careful notes as they talked, the kind of neat, deliberate handwriting that came from years of knowing a file might someday be read by people looking for a reason to doubt her. Neither of them mentioned out loud what it would mean if that hearing went the wrong way, not just for Maggie, but for the quiet work she had traveled 200 miles to do. Some battles are fought in courtrooms. Others are fought in the small, unglamorous hours before anyone sets foot in one, in coffee shops and gravel parking lots over case files nobody outside the room will ever read. That Thursday afternoon, Ruth Callahan was wiping down the counter at the diner when the bell over the door rang. She looked up, expecting a regular. Instead, Cole Dawson walked in alone, his expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately put her on edge. Afternoon, Ruth. Cole. She did not smile. He sat down at the counter, though he did not ask for coffee. I hear you gave that woman her father's badge back. Ruth kept wiping the counter, though the spot beneath her cloth had long since been clean.
Wasn't mine to keep.
Funny thing about property, Dawson said. Sometimes it belongs to more than one story. Depends who's telling it. What do you want, Cole? He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, though the diner was nearly empty. I understand there might be a hearing coming up about the arrest. I wouldn't know anything about that. You might be asked to testify about what you saw that morning. Ruth finally stopped wiping the counter and looked at him directly. I saw you put handcuffs on a woman who did nothing wrong. I saw you step on her father's badge like it was garbage. Something flickered across Dawson's face, gone as quickly as it appeared.
That's one way to remember it, he said quietly. Here's another way to think about it. This town's health inspector is a friend of mine. Diners get inspected every year, sometimes more if there's reason to look closer. Ruth's jaw tightened. Are you threatening my business, Cole Dawson? I'm just talking about how things work, he said, standing up from the stool. Small towns. Everybody depends on everybody else one way or another. Might be worth remembering that before you say something you can't take back in front of a hearing board. He left without ordering anything, the bell over the door ringing sharply behind him. Ruth stood alone at the counter for a long moment, her hands shaking slightly, though not from age this time. She had run that diner for 40 years. It had survived 2 recessions, a highway bypass that nearly killed Main Street traffic,
and a fire in the kitchen back in '98 that could have ended everything. She was not a woman who scared easily. But fear, when it comes wrapped in the language of livelihood, of the roof over your head, has a way of finding even the sturdiest people. She thought about Maggie sitting in that booth 2 mornings ago, calm as still water, even with handcuffs waiting for her outside. She thought about the badge, to protect, not to punish, and what it had cost her, even briefly, to hold on to it. She did not know yet what she would say if she was called to testify. She only knew that Dawson's visit had planted something cold in her chest, and it would take more than warm coffee to shake it loose. That evening, after closing the diner an hour early, Ruth drove out to the motel on the edge of town. She found Maggie sitting outside her room on a plastic chair, watching the sun go down over the fields behind the parking lot. "Mind if I sit?" Ruth asked. "Please." Ruth lowered herself into the chair beside her, quiet for a moment before she spoke. "Cole came by the diner today." Maggie turned to look at her. "What did he want?" "To remind me how small towns work," Ruth said, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "Told me my diner might get looked at closer if I say the wrong thing at your hearing." Maggie's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry. You shouldn't be caught in the middle of this." "I already am," Ruth said. "Have been since the moment I picked that badge up out of the dirt." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade slowly over the wheat fields. "Can I tell you something?" Ruth finally said. "Something I haven't told many people." "Of course." "My husband, before he passed, used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's just deciding something else matters more than the fear does." Ruth's eyes glistened slightly in the dying light. "He learned that the hard way overseas, a long time before I ever met him. He sounds like he was a good man." "He was." Ruth wiped at her eyes quickly, almost embarrassed by the emotion. "I'm scared, Maggie. Scared of losing the only thing I've built in this life. Some nights I think I know exactly what I'll say if they call my name. Other nights I lie awake and I'm not so sure anymore. I wish I could tell you it was simple." Maggie reached over and placed a hand gently on Ruth's arm. "It isn't simple," she said softly. "I'd never pretend it was." "I know you wouldn't." Ruth managed a small, tired smile. "That's part of why I trust you, I think. You don't dress things up prettier than they are." "You don't have to decide tonight." "No," Ruth agreed, "but Friday's coming, whether I've decided or not. Guess I've got a few days left to make peace with whichever way I land." The 2 women sat together as the sky deepened from gold to a soft, bruised purple, saying little else, needing little else the way 2 people sometimes do when the important things have already been said. Below the surface of that quiet motel parking lot, something had shifted, even if it had not yet fully settled. Fear had not disappeared, but it had for the first time that week made room for something else to sit beside it. Not certainty, just the beginning of it. Across town at Whitlock's garage, a mechanic named Curtis Whitlock was elbow deep in the engine of an old pickup truck when his radio, tuned permanently to the town's police scanner out of habit, crackled with a familiar voice. Curtis had lived in Millbrook his whole life. 46 years old, quiet, the kind of man who noticed everything and said very little. His father had run the same garage before him, and his grandfather before that. 3 generations of grease under their fingernails, and 3 generations of minding their own business, mostly. Curtis was not the type to get involved in town gossip. He fixed what people brought him, took their money, and let the rest of it pass by like weather. His shop sat at the far end of 2nd Street, a low brick building with a hand-painted sign that had faded so many summers it was easier to read from memory than from the actual paint. Most people in town could not tell you the shop's official hours. They just knew Curtis was there most days, and that was enough. But he had a code, quiet and unspoken the same way most honest working men do. Fix it right, or don't touch it at all. Charge a fair price. Tell the truth about what's broken, even when a lie would be easier and more profitable. He had fixed cars for half the town, including more than once Cole Dawson's own truck when it wasn't the department cruiser. He did not think much of the man, never had. There was something about the way Dawson talked to people when he thought nobody important was listening. Curtis had heard it plenty of times standing under a hood with grease on his hands, invisible in the way mechanics and waitresses and janitors often are to men who only notice people they think matter. He had happened to be parked outside Ruth's diner that Tuesday morning, waiting on a part delivery phone propped on the dashboard, recording nothing in particular. A habit he had picked up a few years back after his old shop camera finally gave out, and he started using his phone instead, mostly out of the same instinct that made him keep spare parts he might never need, just in case. He hadn't thought much of the footage since. It sat, unremarkable, in his phone's camera roll, tucked between a video of his dog and a clip of a sunset over the wheat fields. He had no idea, standing there that Thursday afternoon with grease on his hands, how much that small, accidental video would come to matter. Some things wait quietly for weeks or months before anyone realizes their weight. By Friday morning, rumors had begun moving through Millbrook the way rumors do in small towns, quickly and with very little regard for accuracy. It had started small, the way these things always do. Somebody at the feed supply mentioned that the woman on the motorcycle had a record somewhere out west. Somebody at the church coffee hour suggested she might be connected to some kind of scam targeting small-town police departments. At the barbershop on 2nd Street, a man named Earl Higgins, who had never once spoken to Maggie, told anyone who would listen that he had heard she once assaulted an officer in another state, though he could not say which state or where he had heard it. By Friday evening, a version of the story had grown legs entirely of its own, traveling from the barbershop to the checkout line at the grocery store, gaining small, ugly details at every stop, the way stories do when nobody bothers to check them against the truth. None of it was true. None of it needed to be to spread. Dawson had not started every rumor personally. He did not need to. He had simply mentioned in passing to 2 or 3 of the right people that there was more to the woman than met the eye, that the department was looking into some concerning things, that folks should maybe be cautious around her. A seed like that, planted carefully in a small town, tends to grow on its own. By the time Maggie walked into the hardware store on Friday afternoon to pick up a spare part for her impounded motorcycle's mirror, she noticed the shift immediately. Conversations stopped when she entered. Eyes moved away too quickly. The clerk behind the counter, a young man who had been perfectly polite 2 days earlier, now answered her questions in short, clipped sentences, eager for her to leave. A woman near the paint section, someone Maggie did not recognize, pulled her shopping basket a little closer as they passed, as though proximity itself might be contagious. Maggie noticed it, filed it away, and said nothing. She had learned, over many years in rooms far more hostile than a small-town hardware store, that reacting to fear rarely calmed it. Sometimes the only thing to do was let people see through steady behavior, rather than defensive words, that the story they had been told did not match the woman standing in front of them. It was slower than arguing. It was also, in her experience, far more effective in the long run. She did not react outwardly. She had trained herself over many years not to. But walking back out onto Main Street, she felt something she had not expected to feel in a town like this. Loneliness. Not the quiet, comfortable kind she usually carried with her on long rides. Something sharper. The particular loneliness of being misunderstood by people who had never once spoken to her directly. Frank Delaney was sitting on his usual bench outside the diner when she passed. He tipped his cap slightly as she walked by, the same as he always did, unaffected by whatever whispers had been moving through town that week. "Morning," he said simply. "Morning," Maggie answered, surprised by how much that single, ordinary word meant to her in that moment. "Don't mind the noise," Frank said, nodding faintly toward the street behind her. "Small towns talk loud and think quiet. Give it time. Truth's got a way of outlasting gossip, even when it takes its sweet time getting there." "Thank you," Maggie said. "Wasn't thanks I was after," Frank said, settling back against the bench. "Just fact. Your father believed the same." She paused. "You knew him too?" "Everybody worth knowing in this town knew Daniel Whitfield," Frank said. "Some of us just remember better than others." "Can I ask you something, Mr. Delaney?" "Go ahead." Why aren't you worried about being seen talking to me? I mean, everyone else in town seems to be. Frank considered the question for a long moment, his eyes drifting toward the flagpole across the street. At my age, you stop worrying much about what other folks think of who you sit with. Worried about that plenty when I was young. Cost me more peace than it was ever worth. That's a hard thing to learn. Takes most people a lifetime, Frank agreed. Lucky ones learn it a little sooner. Maggie allowed herself a small smile, the first genuine one in 2 days, and continued down the street, carrying that small kindness with her like a coin in her pocket. By Saturday, the situation had escalated further. Captain Corrigan called an internal meeting, citing what he described as a growing concern about public safety and department integrity related to the ongoing situation with Maggie Whitfield. In that meeting, Dawson presented a new piece of information, a witness statement freshly signed from a man named Dale Pruitt, a local with a history of minor offenses, mostly traffic violations, and one old charge years back for public intoxication that Dawson himself had once quietly let slide. Dale's statement claimed he had witnessed Maggie speaking aggressively to Dawson during the Tuesday morning arrest, going so far as to describe a physical shove that had never happened. Denise, sitting near the back of the meeting room, felt her stomach turn as she listened. She had spoken to Dale Pruitt exactly twice in her 2 years on the force. Both times he had been trying to talk his way out of a citation. She knew the way you know certain things without needing proof yet that his statement was not the truth. One of the other officers in the room, a heavy-set veteran named Officer Griggs, who mostly kept to himself, raised a hand slightly. "This Pruitt fellow," Griggs said slowly. "Isn't he the same one who got picked up for public intox back in the spring? Thought that got dropped." "It was handled appropriately at the time," Dawson said quickly. "Handled how?" "Verbal warning," Corrigan said, waving a hand as though the detail were beneath discussion. "Not relevant to today's matter." Griggs glanced toward Denise for half a second, an unspoken question passing between them. Neither of them said anything further. But she said nothing in that meeting. Not yet. She was beginning to understand something uncomfortable about her department, something she had perhaps sensed for a while without letting herself fully see it. Truth, in some rooms, was not always the deciding factor. Sometimes the deciding factor was simply who was willing to speak the loudest and who had the most to lose by staying quiet. Corrigan, satisfied with the new statement, made his decision. "We'll schedule a formal disciplinary hearing," he announced. "Friday, 6 o'clock, at the county building. Given the new witness statement, we'll also be forwarding the file to the district attorney's office for review of possible charges." Dawson, sitting near the front, allowed himself the smallest, most private smile. He had built himself a narrative, brick by brick over 4 days. A story that turned a quiet woman with a father's badge into a threat the town needed protecting from. He did not yet understand, sitting in that meeting room, feeling satisfied with himself, that every brick he had laid could just as easily become evidence against the wall he thought he was building. After the meeting ended, Denise lingered near the coffee machine, gathering her thoughts, when Officer Griggs approached, refilling his own cup, slowly. "You've got that look," Griggs said quietly, not looking directly at her. "What look?" "The one I used to get 20 years back, right before I decided to say something I probably shouldn't have." Denise glanced around to make sure no one else was within earshot. "Did it work out for you, saying something?" Griggs considered the question longer than she expected. "Cost me a promotion I was in line for, made things uncomfortable around here for about a year." He paused. "But I sleep fine at night. That's worth more than most people think, until they don't have it anymore." "What would you do if you were me?" "I'd be careful," Griggs said. "Careful isn't the same as quiet, though. Careful means you build something solid before you speak, so when you finally do, nobody can knock it down easy." Denise turned that over in her mind. "That's what I've been trying to do." "Then keep doing it," Griggs said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Just don't wait too long. Friday's got a way of arriving faster than folks expect." He walked off without another word, leaving Denise standing there with her notebook tucked under one arm, feeling for the first time in days that she was not entirely alone in what she was carrying. She thought about that word careful, turning it over the rest of the afternoon. It was not the same as cautious, and it was certainly not the same as quiet. Careful the way Griggs meant it sounded almost like a kind of courage that simply hadn't announced itself yet. That evening, back at her apartment above the old post office building, Denise spread her notes across the kitchen table. Case numbers, dates, the mistyped plate, the 4 solo arrests, Dale Pruitt's conveniently timed statement, and the public intoxication charge that had quietly disappeared months earlier. She organized it all methodically the way her uncle had taught her to organize anything that mattered. Not for a courtroom. Not yet, just for herself, and for the moment when the timing might finally be right to hand it to someone who could use it properly. That same evening, Maggie sat in her motel room reading over the notice Grace had forwarded her, informing her of the scheduled hearing. 6 days from now, Friday, 6 o'clock. She read the words twice, feeling the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever a case turned formal, whenever paper began to carry more weight than truth. She thought about her father again, the way she often did in moments like this. He had once told her that paperwork could bury a good man just as easily as it could convict a guilty one. The system, he said, was only as fair as the people running it chose to make it. She picked up her phone and called Marcus Reed one more time. "They've filed a formal hearing," she said. "Friday, 6 days out." "That's fast." "It's meant to be. They're trying to close this before anyone outside the department starts asking real questions." "You want me to move now?" Maggie considered it carefully. 6 days was not much time, but rushing federal involvement too early had its own risks. Departments, under sudden outside scrutiny, had a way of destroying evidence faster than they preserved it, especially when that evidence pointed toward one of their own. "Not yet. If we move too early, they'll have time to clean up everything before the hearing. I need you ready to walk in the moment it matters, not a day before." "You're taking a risk, Whitfield. I know." "You're certain about this?" Maggie looked down at the small, worn badge sitting on the nightstand beside her. "To protect, not to punish," catching the dim light of the motel lamp. "I'm certain. The truth needs a little more time to surface properly," she said. Rushing it now would only give them a chance to bury it deeper. Reed was quiet for a moment. "All right, but Whitfield, if that hearing turns against you before we're ready to step in, it could get ugly fast. Public record, possible charges. That's not something easily undone, even once the truth comes out." "I understand the risk." "Good," Reed said, "because I think you're about to become the most talked about woman in that town for reasons that have nothing to do with the truth." He was not wrong. By the following Monday, in what had become a week far larger than the simple traffic stop that started it, Millbrook had fully divided itself into 2 quiet camps. Those who believed the whispers Dawson had planted, and those who, like Ruth, like Frank, like Denise, like Walter, felt a small, persistent unease they could not quite explain, but could not quite ignore either. Ruth found herself lying awake that Monday night, staring at her bedroom ceiling, the same question circling back on itself over and over. She thought about the diner, 40 years of memories held together by nothing more than flour, coffee, and stubbornness. She thought about what it would mean to lose it at 74 years old with nothing left to rebuild it with. She thought about the badge she had carried home in her apron pocket and the words engraved on its back. To protect, not to punish. She was not a police officer. She had never sworn any oath. But somewhere in the quiet hours of that Monday night, Ruth Callahan let herself admit something she had been circling for days without quite landing on it. Some promises did not require a badge to matter. Some promises simply required a person willing to keep them even when it cost something real. She still did not know exactly what words would come out of her mouth when Friday finally arrived, standing in front of strangers with her whole life on the line. But she knew with a certainty that surprised her that staying silent would cost her something too. Just a different kind of price. The kind you pay quietly for years every time you look in the mirror and remember the moment you chose not to speak. Denise Colton faced a similar reckoning that same week, though her uncertainty took a different shape. She had gathered enough discrepancies in Dawson's reports to fill half her small notebook. The mistyped plate number, the 4 solo arrests with no secondary officer present, the sudden, convenient corruption of the very dashcam footage that could confirm or deny everything. And now a witness statement she had strong reason to believe was fabricated, coming from a man Dawson had personally let off the hook years earlier. She understood with growing clarity that bringing any of this forward would not be simple. Corrigan had already shown in that meeting which direction he preferred the story to bend. Speaking up meant risking her job, her reputation, possibly her entire career in a department that had little patience for officers who complicated, clean, convenient stories. She thought of her uncle again, the trooper who had raised her, in many ways more than her own busy parents ever had time to. She thought of the note in her notebook. The badge asks you to serve. It never asks you to look away. On Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 week after Maggie's arrest, Denise made a quiet decision. She would not go to Corrigan directly, not yet. She did not trust that path to lead anywhere honest. Instead, she began preparing something else entirely. A private, detailed timeline backed by dates, case numbers, and small inconsistencies most people would never think to notice. Not evidence for a courtroom, not yet. Just the truth, written down carefully, waiting for the moment it might matter most. She did not know that a mechanic across town was doing something similar in his own quiet way, simply by not deleting a video he had almost forgotten existed. She did not know that an old sheriff was making calls to former colleagues, gently asking questions about a young woman's father, confirming details that would matter more than anyone yet realized. She did not know that Maggie Whitfield, 200 miles from her own quiet office, had colleagues watching a calendar count down toward a Friday evening hearing with far more attention than Corrigan or Dawson could possibly imagine. Millbrook on the surface looked like it always had. Slow mornings, church bells at 6, a dog barking at nothing down on Elm Street. But beneath that surface, 6 different people in 6 different corners of that small town were each quietly deciding the same thing without knowing the others had decided it too. That silence, however comfortable, however safe it might feel in the moment, had become a debt. And debts, sooner or later, always come due. The following Wednesday, 2 days before the hearing, Maggie received an unexpected visit at her motel. Walter Boone knocked twice, then let himself lean against the doorframe when she opened it, cane in one hand, folder in the other. "Got something you should see," he said. She let him in, offering the room's single chair while she sat on the edge of the bed. Walter opened the folder slowly. Inside were copies of old department records, the kind that existed only on paper tucked away in filing cabinets nobody had touched in years. "Made some calls," he said. "Old friends who still owe me favors. Turns out your Officer Dawson has a longer history than what's sitting in his current file." Maggie leaned forward. "How long?" 3 complaints filed and quietly dismissed going back almost 5 years. 2 from women passing through town. 1 from a young mother who said he detained her without cause outside the grocery store. None of that made it into any formal review. "Small towns protect their own," Walter said, his voice heavy with something between regret and anger. "I did the same thing more than once back when I wore the badge. Told myself I was keeping the peace, not making waves. Looking back, I'm not proud of every choice I made that way." "What changed?" Walter was quiet for a moment, turning the question over. "Retirement gives a man time to look backward, honestly. When you're still wearing the badge, you're always looking forward, thinking about the next call, the next fire to put out. You don't always stop to ask whether the fires you're putting out started because of choices you made or choices you let slide. That's a hard thing to carry." "It is," Walter admitted. "But carrying it honestly is better than pretending the weight isn't there at all. That's a lesson it took me longer to learn than I'd like to admit." Maggie studied the papers carefully. "This could matter if we can establish a pattern, not just an incident." "That's why I brought it," Walter said. "Figured you'd know what to do with it better than I would." "Thank you, Walter." "Don't thank me yet," he said, echoing, without knowing it, the exact words Grace had used days earlier. "Thank me once this town does right by your father's memory. Until then, this is just paperwork trying to catch up to a truth everybody around here already half suspected." He stood slowly, tucking his cane under one arm. "Your father had a saying," he added, pausing at the door. "Said the truth doesn't need to hurry. It just needs somebody patient enough to wait for it properly." "He said the same thing to me," Maggie said softly. "More than once." "Guess some lessons stick around longer than the people who taught them," Walter said, and let himself out into the cooling evening air. Maggie sat alone for a long while after he left the folder open on her lap, the motel room quiet except for the distant hum of the highway. Friday was closing in fast. 2 days now until the hearing that could end her investigation before it truly began. 2 days until Ruth would have to decide whether fear or conscience carried more weight. 2 days until Denise would have to decide whether silence still felt like safety or whether it had quietly become something closer to complicity. 2 days until a mechanic's forgotten video, an old sheriff's borrowed favors, and a young officer's careful notebook would either come together in time or arrive one day too late. Maggie closed the folder gently and looked once more at the badge sitting on the nightstand. To protect, not to punish. 6 words her father had carried every day of his working life through fires and funerals and quiet Tuesday mornings that never made the news. She intended to carry them the same way, whatever Friday brought. Not because she was certain of the outcome, because some things her father had taught her were worth doing correctly regardless of how the story ended. She thought too about the strange, quiet arithmetic of the past week. A traffic stop that should have taken 10 minutes had somehow unearthed 5 years of buried complaints, a fabricated witness statement, a diner owner's hidden courage, a young officer's careful notebook, and a mechanic's forgotten video, all moving toward the same Friday evening without any of them fully realizing how connected they had become. Her father believed justice rarely arrived the way people expected it to. It did not usually come as a single dramatic moment, a courtroom gavel, a headline in bold print. More often, he said, it arrived slowly, built by ordinary people making small, unglamorous choices day after day, until enough of those choices stacked up to tip the scale. An old sheriff making phone calls he did not have to make. A diner owner choosing honesty over her own fear. A young officer filling a notebook nobody had asked her to fill. None of them on their own seemed capable of changing much of anything. Together, without any of them fully realizing it yet, they were quietly building the very thing Cole Dawson least expected to find waiting for him on Friday evening. Not a single accuser standing alone against him. A town slowly, reluctantly remembering how to stand together. Maggie thought about calling Marcus Reed again, then decided against it. She had told him what she needed to. The rest was simply a matter of waiting and preparing and trusting the people around her more than she was naturally inclined to. Trust did not come easily to her. It never had, not since the fire on Route 9 had taken the one person she had trusted most completely. But sitting there, in that quiet motel room 8 days into a week that had upended an entire town's sense of itself, she found herself trusting Ruth's courage and Walter's memory and Denise's careful patience more than she had expected to trust almost anyone since her father died. Maybe that was its own kind of healing, she thought. Not the absence of grief, but the slow, quiet return of faith in ordinary people doing the right thing simply because it was right, with no guarantee of reward waiting for them on the other side. Outside her window, the sun dropped low over the wheat fields, painting Millbrook gold one more time, the same soft color it wore every evening, indifferent to whatever storm was quietly gathering beneath its calm. 8 days had passed since a pair of handcuffs closed around her wrists in a gravel parking lot. 2 days until a hearing that would decide far more than anyone in that county building yet realized. Somewhere in that town, a diner owner lay awake, rehearsing words she had never expected to need. Somewhere a young officer reread her uncle's handwriting one more time before turning off the light. Somewhere a mechanic scrolled absently past an old video on his phone, still not fully aware of what it held. And somewhere, 200 miles away, a man named Marcus Reed circled a date on his calendar and waited the same patient way Maggie had asked him to. Friday was coming, whether Millbrook was ready for it or not. It rarely announces itself gently a day like that. It simply arrives the same way every Friday arrives, except that this one would carry more weight than the calendar page could ever show. Millbrook, for all its slow mornings and familiar bells, had no idea yet how much of itself it was about to see clearly for the first time. Friday arrived the way most important days do in small towns, quietly at first, with nothing about the morning light suggesting anything unusual was about to happen. The diner opened at 6, same as always. The church bell rang at 6, same as always. But by noon, Millbrook felt different. The way a room feels different once everyone in it knows something is coming, even if nobody says it out loud. At the diner, regulars lingered a little longer over their coffee than usual, conversations dropping to a lower register whenever the subject of the evening's hearing came up. At the hardware store, the clerk who had been so quick to usher Maggie out the door a week earlier found himself, unprompted, defending her to a customer who repeated one of the uglier rumors circulating that week. "Don't know the whole story," he admitted afterward, almost surprised at himself. "But something about the way folks have been talking just hasn't sat right with me." Small shifts like that had been happening quietly all week, ever since Ruth's confrontation with Dawson at the diner became itself a piece of town gossip, though a very different kind than the rumors Dawson had originally planted. By midweek, even the barber who had first spread word of Maggie's supposed record out west had gone quiet on the subject, mumbling something about how he might have gotten ahead of himself. Nobody corrected him out loud. Nobody needed to. The silence itself said enough. Maggie spent the morning at the motel going over notes with Grace Ashford one final time. "They'll try to move fast," Grace said, gathering papers into a folder. "Corrigan wants this closed tonight, one way or another." "I know." "The dashcam footage request I filed. Still no confirmation it's been preserved." Maggie's jaw tightened slightly. "How much time is left on the retention window?" Grace checked her notes. "Technically, it expires sometime tonight. Which means if that footage exists, and if it shows what you say it shows, we need it in that hearing room before the system wipes it." "And if it doesn't arrive in time?" Grace met her eyes steadily. "Then we go in with what we have, which isn't nothing, but it isn't everything either." Maggie nodded slowly, folding her hands in her lap. She had faced harder odds before, in rooms far more consequential than a county hearing hall in a town of 2,000 people. But there was something different about this one. Something personal in a way most of her cases had never been. She thought of the training rooms she had once sat in years earlier, learning the careful architecture of a legal argument, the discipline of building a case brick by brick until it could withstand almost any challenge. None of that training had quite prepared her for how different it felt to build a case not on behalf of a stranger, but on behalf of her own name, her own father's memory, her own quiet sense of what a badge was supposed to mean. Her father's name was tied to this town. Her father's badge sat even now on the nightstand beside her bed, waiting. She was not simply defending herself today. She was defending the 6 words engraved on the back of that badge, words her father had lived and died by. She thought briefly of every small kindness the past week and a half had handed her without asking for anything back. A cup of coffee on the house, a business card from an old sheriff's coat pocket, a single quiet nod from a young officer across a station lobby. None of those things would show up in any transcript tonight, but she carried them into that hearing room all the same, the way a person carries warmth from an earlier fire long after the flames themselves have gone out. To protect, not to punish. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Ruth Callahan closed the diner early for the second time that week. She hung a small handwritten sign in the window, "Closed for a family matter, back tomorrow." It was not entirely a lie. In the 10 days since Maggie's arrest, Ruth had come to think of her in some quiet, unspoken way as something closer to family than she had expected. She drove to the county building alone, her hands steady on the wheel despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Across town, Denise Colton sat in her patrol car outside the station, notebook resting on the passenger seat beside her. She had made her decision 3 days earlier, in the quiet of her apartment above the old post office. She would attend the hearing. She would bring what she had, and whatever happened afterward, she would live with the consequences of having spoken, rather than the quieter, heavier consequences of having stayed silent. At Whitlock's garage, Curtis wiped his hands on a rag and locked up early, something he almost never did on a Friday. He had thought more than once that week about the video sitting quietly in his phone. He was not entirely sure it mattered. He was not entirely sure what he had even captured beyond a few seconds of an ordinary-looking arrest outside Ruth's diner. But something about the way the town had been talking that week about the woman on the motorcycle, about rumors that felt thinner every time he heard them repeated, made him decide to bring his phone along just in case. Fix what you can see broken, but keep something ready just in case, for the trouble you can't see coming yet. His father's old advice still holding up after all these years. By 5:30 that evening, the small hearing room at the Millbrook County building had begun to fill. Wooden benches, worn smooth by decades of use, faced a long table where 3 review board members sat flanked by Captain Corrigan on one side, and near the back, a scattering of townspeople who had come simply because word had spread that something significant might happen that night. Maggie sat beside Grace at a smaller table near the front, her father's badge tucked discreetly into the inside pocket of her jacket. Dawson sat across the aisle, uniform pressed, expression carefully composed into something resembling quiet confidence. At 6 o'clock exactly, the hearing began. The room had filled to nearly every seat by then, an unusually large crowd for a county hearing that would normally draw only the parties directly involved. Word had clearly traveled further than Corrigan had hoped it would. The board chairperson, a stern-looking woman named Judge Eleanor Marsh, serving in her capacity as county hearing officer, called the room to order. This hearing concerns the conduct of Officer Cole Dawson during the arrest and subsequent detainment of Margaret Whitfield on the morning of 10 days ago, she said, reading from her notes. Additionally, this hearing will consider a formal complaint against Miss Whitfield regarding alleged obstruction and a threat of physical force during that same incident. Dawson was called first. He gave his account, smoothly practiced the story he had been rehearsing internally for the better part of 10 days. A registration discrepancy, a subject who grew combative, a justified use of restraint entirely within department protocol. He did not mention the boot print left in the gravel. He did not mention the badge. When Grace rose to cross-examine him, she asked calmly about the dashcam footage. Officer Dawson, can you explain why the footage from your patrol vehicle that morning has been marked as corrupted in the department system? Technical malfunction, Dawson said smoothly. Happens more often than people realize with older equipment. And the plate number discrepancy that initiated the stop, can you explain that? System lag, Dawson said. Not uncommon with out-of-state registrations. Officer Dawson, is it standard department procedure to remove personal items from a detained individual's belongings and place them on the ground? I was conducting a lawful search. Was it also standard procedure to step on those items during that search? A ripple of quiet murmurs moved through the room. That was an accident, Dawson said, his composure slipping slightly for the first time. I was turning to secure the subject. An accident, Grace repeated, letting the words sit in the air for a moment. Captured coincidentally on video that your own department dashcam somehow failed to record. Objection, Corrigan interjected, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Counsel is speculating. Withdrawn, Grace said calmly, already moving on. I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor. For now. Grace did not press further, not yet. She simply made a note and sat back down. Next came Dale Pruitt. He walked to the witness chair with the nervous energy of a man who had rehearsed his lines but had not fully convinced himself of them. I saw the whole thing, he said, when asked to describe what he had witnessed. She pushed him, told him she'd make him regret arresting her. Maggie's expression did not change, though. Beside her, Grace's pen paused briefly over her notepad. When Grace rose to question him, her tone remained even, almost gentle. Mr. Pruitt, where exactly were you standing when you witnessed this? Dale hesitated. Across the street, by the hardware store. That's roughly 40 yards from the diner entrance, is that correct? I suppose. And you were able to hear a specific verbal threat from that distance? I heard what I heard. Isn't it true, Mr. Pruitt, that you received a citation warning from Officer Dawson back in the spring, one that was never formally logged? Dale's eyes flicked briefly toward Dawson before returning to Grace. I don't know what you're talking about. We have department records suggesting otherwise, Grace said calmly. Records showing a public intoxication incident that never appeared in any formal report. Corrigan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Counselor, is this relevant to tonight's hearing? Very relevant, Your Honor, Grace said. It speaks directly to the credibility of a key witness. The room had grown noticeably quieter. Judge Marsh studied Dale for a long moment. Mr. Pruitt, I'll remind you that providing false testimony under these proceedings carries serious legal consequences. Dale shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sweat beginning to bead faintly at his hairline. I might have been standing a little further than I said. Did you witness a physical shove? A long pause. I heard some raised voices, can't say for certain about the rest. It was not a full retraction, but it was enough of a crack to send a visible ripple of unease through the room. Ruth was called next. She walked to the witness chair slowly, her hands folded tightly in front of her, the weight of the past 10 days visible in the careful way she moved. She had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in her head over the past 2 nights, lying awake, running through what she might say, what Dawson might say back, what it might cost her if the wrong words slipped out under pressure. None of the rehearsals had quite prepared her for how loud the room felt now that she was actually sitting in it. Mrs. Callahan, Judge Marsh said, can you describe what you witnessed that morning? Ruth glanced briefly toward Dawson, then toward Maggie, then back to the judge. For a moment she said nothing at all, and the silence stretched long enough that a few people in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Somewhere in the back row, Frank Delaney sat with his cap in his lap, watching her closely, the same steady patience in his eyes that he carried every morning by the flagpole. Ruth thought of her husband. She thought of the badge she had carried home in her apron pocket. She thought of 40 years of coffee and flour and stubbornness and what it would mean to lose all of it. Then she thought of something else entirely. The particular quiet of lying awake at night for years to come, remembering the moment she had chosen silence over truth. I saw Officer Dawson stop a woman who had done nothing wrong, Ruth said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I saw him handcuff her without cause, and I saw him take her father's badge out of her bag and step on it deliberately, right there on the gravel outside my diner. A murmur moved through the room. Are you certain it was deliberate? Judge Marsh asked. I've run that diner for 40 years, Ruth said. I've seen plenty of accidents. That wasn't one. Dawson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though his expression remained otherwise composed. Mrs. Callahan, Corrigan interjected, his voice edged with something close to warning. I'd remind you that your business operates under county licensing, and inaccurate testimony under oath carries its own consequences. The threat, thinly veiled, hung in the air. Ruth met his gaze without flinching. I've told the truth, Captain. If that costs me my dinner, then I suppose it costs me my dinner. I've built harder things than that from nothing before. For a long moment the room was completely silent. Then from the back row, Frank Delaney began slowly, deliberately to clap. Just twice. Quiet, measured applause that felt less like enthusiasm and more like solemn agreement. A few others in the room followed hesitantly at first, then with more conviction. Judge Marsh raised a hand for order, though something in her expression suggested she was not entirely displeased by the interruption. It was, in its own small way, the first crack in the story Dawson had spent 10 days building. But it was not, on its own, enough. Corrigan, sensing the room's mood shifting, moved quickly to regain control. Given the testimony presented tonight, he said, "and absent any physical evidence contradicting Officer Dawson's official report, I move that this board proceed with formal charges against Miss Whitfield for obstruction, pending referral to the district attorney's office." Judge Marsh glanced toward the other two board members, both nodding slightly, clearly inclined to accept Corrigan's framing. "Without the dashcam footage," she said slowly, "and given the ambiguity in witness accounts tonight, I'm inclined to agree that the department's official report stands as the primary evidence available to this board." Grace rose quickly. "Your Honor, we've formally requested that footage be preserved and produced. If the department has failed to do so, that failure shouldn't be held against my client." "Noted," Judge Marsh said. "But this board can only rule on the evidence in front of it tonight." For a moment, sitting at that small table, Maggie felt something she had not expected to feel. Not fear, exactly, something closer to the quiet, heavy weight of watching a system she had once trusted almost completely bend slowly toward the version of events that was simply easier to accept. She thought of her father and the fires he had run into without hesitation. She thought of the 6 words on the back of his badge, and she waited the way he had taught her to wait patiently for the truth to find its footing. It was at that exact moment that the door at the back of the hearing room opened. Denise Colton walked in, still in uniform, her notebook clutched tightly in one hand. She had debated, right up until the last possible moment, whether to walk through that door at all. Griggs had caught her in the hallway just minutes earlier, saying nothing, simply placing a steady hand on her shoulder before nodding toward the door, as if to say the moment she'd been preparing for had finally arrived. Beside her walked Curtis Whitlock, still in his grease-stained work shirt, phone held carefully in his other hand. "Your Honor," Denise said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room, "I have information relevant to this hearing." Corrigan turned sharply. "Officer Colton, this is not the appropriate venue." "With respect, Captain," Denise said, her voice steady, despite the visible tremor beneath it, "I believe it's exactly the appropriate venue." Judge Marsh studied her carefully. "Proceed, officer." Denise walked forward and placed her notebook on the table in front of the board. "Over the past week and a half, I documented a series of discrepancies in Officer Dawson's reports," she said. "A mistyped plate number that initiated an unlawful stop, 4 prior arrests involving women traveling alone, all closed without formal review, and an undisclosed prior interaction with witness Dale Pruitt, one that Officer Dawson personally chose not to log." The room had gone completely still. "Additionally," Denise continued, "I have reason to believe the dashcam footage from that morning was not in fact corrupted, but deliberately marked as such to prevent its review." Corrigan's face had gone pale. "That's a serious accusation, officer." "Yes, sir," Denise said. "It is." Curtis stepped forward then, clearing his throat awkwardly, unaccustomed to being the center of attention in a room full of people. "I might have something that helps clear some of this up," he said. "Was parked outside the diner that morning, waiting on a delivery, had my phone out, caught a bit of what happened, didn't think much of it at the time." He held up his phone. "Your Honor," Grace said, quickly rising from her seat, "I'd ask that this recording be reviewed immediately, given its direct relevance to tonight's proceedings." Judge Marsh considered for a moment, then nodded. "Play it." Curtis connected his phone to the small projector at the side of the room, hands slightly unsteady, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden weight of the moment. The video began. Grainy shot from across the street, but clear enough. It showed Dawson circling the motorcycle. It showed him speaking to Maggie, his posture aggressive, hers calm. It showed him removing the badge from her saddlebag, tossing it to the ground, and stepping on it as he turned, an action that, on video, looked anything but accidental. It showed Maggie's hands remaining still at her sides throughout, no shove, no threat, nothing resembling the story Dawson had told at the start of the hearing. The room sat in heavy silence as the short video played out. When it ended, nobody spoke for a long moment. Dawson's face had drained of all its earlier composure. "That footage is out of context," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You can't see everything that happened." "We can see enough," Judge Marsh said quietly, her expression hardening. It was at that moment that the door opened once more. A man in a plain gray suit walked in, calm, unhurried, carrying a slim leather folder under one arm. He did not look like anyone from Millbrook. His presence alone seemed to shift the air in the room. "My apologies for the interruption," he said. "My name is Marcus Reed. I'm a senior investigator with the State Attorney General's Office Police Integrity Division." Corrigan stood abruptly. "This is a closed county hearing?" "It was," Reed said calmly, producing his credentials and setting them on the table for the board to examine, "until tonight, when it became directly relevant to an ongoing state investigation." He turned toward Maggie, offering the faintest, most professional of nods. "Agent Whitfield," he said, "good work these past 3 months." A wave of confused murmurs moved through the room. Judge Marsh looked between Maggie and Reed, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to understanding. "Would someone care to explain what's happening here?" she asked. Reed opened his folder. "For the past 3 months, this office has been conducting a quiet investigation into a pattern of complaints against the Millbrook Police Department, specifically involving Officer Cole Dawson. 7 prior complaints, all closed without formal review, mirroring almost exactly what Officer Colton has just described to this board." He paused, letting that settle over the room. "Margaret Whitfield is a state investigator assigned to this case. Her presence in Millbrook this past week and a half, including the incident at the diner, was not planned as part of the investigation, but it has unintentionally provided some of the clearest evidence we've gathered in 3 months of quiet work." Dawson stared at Maggie, something between disbelief and fury crossing his face. "You're a cop." "I was a military attorney," Maggie said quietly, standing slowly from her seat. "Now, I investigate exactly the kind of pattern you spent 10 days trying to hide." "This is entrapment," Dawson said, his voice rising. "You set me up." "No," Maggie said, her voice calm but carrying clearly through the silent room. "You did that yourself, Officer Dawson. Every choice these past 10 days was yours. The badge, the false report, the witness you pressured into lying. I simply happened to be standing in front of you when you made them." Judge Marsh turned to Corrigan, her expression cold. "Captain, did you have any awareness of this pattern prior to tonight?" Corrigan's mouth opened, then closed again, no answer readily available. "I think," Judge Marsh said slowly, "that answer speaks for itself." Reed stepped forward, addressing the board directly. "Given the evidence presented tonight, combined with the findings of our ongoing investigation, I'd request this board suspend all charges against Agent Whitfield immediately and refer Officer Dawson's conduct for formal state review alongside Captain Corrigan's apparent failure to act on prior complaints." Judge Marsh did not hesitate long. "All charges against Miss Whitfield are dismissed, effective immediately," she said. "Officer Dawson, you are relieved of duty pending full investigation. Captain Corrigan, this board will be recommending a separate review of your conduct in this matter as well." Dawson sat frozen for a moment, then rose abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is unbelievable," he said, though the fire in his voice had already begun to falter into something closer to disbelief. 2 officers near the door, following a quiet nod from Judge Marsh, stepped forward to escort him out of the room. As he passed Maggie's table, he paused, looking down at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You could have just told me," he said quietly, "who you were." "Would it have changed anything?" Maggie asked. "Or would you have simply hidden the pattern more carefully?" Dawson had no answer for that. He walked out of the room in silence, the door closing heavily behind him. The hearing room remained quiet for a long moment afterward, the weight of everything that had just happened settling slowly over the people gathered there. Ruth was the first to move, crossing the room to where Maggie stood, pulling her into a tight, unhesitating embrace. "I knew it," Ruth whispered. "Not the details, but I knew there was more to you than this town gave you credit for." "Thank you for standing up tonight," Maggie said. "That took real courage." "Courage is easier," Ruth said, "when you've got good people standing beside you." Denise approached, next notebook still in hand, looking somewhat dazed by the speed of everything that had just unfolded. "I wasn't sure that would matter," she admitted. "The notebook, I mean." "It mattered," Maggie said, "more than you know. My uncle always said the badge asks you to serve, never to look away," Denise said. Guess tonight I finally understood what that actually meant. Walter Boone made his way slowly through the thinning crowd, leaning on his cane, a faint, satisfied smile on his weathered face. "Your father would be proud tonight," he said simply. "I hope so," Maggie said. "I don't hope," Walter said. "I know so. Watched that same look in his eyes more times than I can count. You've got it too." Curtis lingered near the back of the room, uncertain, until Maggie walked over and extended her hand. "Thank you," she said. "That video mattered more than you probably realize." "Didn't think much of it at the time," Curtis admitted, shaking her hand firmly. "Guess sometimes the small things end up mattering the most." "They usually do," Maggie said. Grace approached last, closing her folder with a satisfied, tired sigh. "I have had easier weeks," she said. "I'm sorry to have put you through it, half-blind." "Don't apologize," Grace said. "I told you once, half-blind is still better odds than most of my clients get. Turns out, I was right." She extended her hand. "It's been a genuine privilege, Agent Whitfield. Just Maggie is fine." "Not tonight, it isn't," Grace said, with the first real smile Maggie had seen from her all week. "Tonight, you earned the title." Judge Marsh, gathering her own papers at the front of the room, paused briefly beside their table. "Agent Whitfield," she said, "I'll admit I very nearly ruled against you tonight, based on the evidence in front of me at the time." "I understand, Your Honor." "What troubles me," Judge Marsh continued, "is how easily this could have gone the other way if a mechanic hadn't happened to have his phone out, or if a young officer hadn't kept a private notebook nobody asked her to keep." "It troubles me too," Maggie admitted. "Systems shouldn't depend on luck to find the truth," Judge Marsh said. "I intend to recommend some procedural changes to this county's review process based on tonight. Small comfort, perhaps, but it's something." "It's not small," Maggie said. "It's exactly the kind of change that actually matters long after tonight is forgotten." Judge Marsh studied her for a moment, something like respect settling into her expression. "Your father would be proud, I imagine, though I only know him by reputation." "Everyone keeps telling me that tonight," Maggie said softly. "Maybe that's because it's true," Judge Marsh said, and continued on her way out of the room. Outside the county building, the evening air had turned cool. The kind of early autumn chill that reminded Millbrook winter was not far behind. Maggie stood on the courthouse steps for a long moment, breathing it in, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 10 long days. Marcus Reed found her there a few minutes later, his gray suit jacket now unbuttoned, looking for the first time since she had known him faintly pleased with how an assignment had concluded. "Good work, Whitfield," he said. "I got lucky," Maggie admitted. "If Curtis hadn't had that video, if Denise hadn't kept that notebook, tonight goes very differently." "Luck helps," Reed said, "but luck doesn't build the kind of trust that made a diner owner risk her business, or an officer risk her career, or a mechanic bother keeping his phone out in the first place. That's not luck. That's what happens when people believe, even quietly, even reluctantly, that the truth still matters." "You think that's rare?" "Rarer than it should be," Reed said. "Which is exactly why what happened tonight is worth remembering long after the case file closes." He handed her a slim folder. "Your next assignment, whenever you're ready. No rush. Take the time you need here first. Something tells me this town could use a little more of your attention before you move on." Maggie took the folder without opening it. "Thank you, Marcus." "Thank your father," Reed said, echoing words she had now heard more times in the past 10 days than in the 6 years since his funeral. "Every report I've read on this case, every complaint that finally surfaced, ties back to a lesson he apparently spent a career teaching this town, whether it always wanted to learn it or not." In the weeks that followed, the fallout from that Friday evening hearing moved quickly through Millbrook and beyond. Officer Cole Dawson was formally terminated from the department, facing state charges for falsifying official reports and witness tampering. A state forensic team brought in by Marcus Reed's office the following week recovered the supposedly corrupted dashcam file from the cruiser's hard drive before it could be overwritten. The footage matched Curtis's video almost exactly, and confirmed something even more damning. Audio of Dawson, moments before the badge hit the ground, muttering to himself that he intended to teach her a lesson. That single recovered file became the centerpiece of the criminal case against him. Additional complaints from women in neighboring counties who had read about the case in the regional newspaper began surfacing within days, each one adding another brick to a pattern that had, for years, remained conveniently invisible. One of those women, a school teacher from a town 40 miles east, wrote a short letter to the local paper describing an incident strikingly similar to Maggie's own, an incident she had never reported at the time, believing, as many people do, that nobody would take her word over an officer's. "I stopped believing it was worth saying anything a long time ago," she wrote. "Reading about what happened in Millbrook reminded me that silence protects the wrong people far more often than it protects the right ones." Her letter was reprinted twice over the following month, quoted by 2 other regional papers covering the growing story. Captain Hank Corrigan resigned quietly 3 weeks later before a formal review could conclude, though most in town understood exactly what that resignation represented. He did not leave Millbrook. He simply stopped wearing the uniform, taking a job managing inventory at the feed supply store, a smaller, quieter life than the one he had spent 30 years building. Some in town found it hard to look at him the same way afterward. Others, more forgiving, noted that a man who finally stepped aside, however late, was still a different thing than a man who refused to step aside at all. Dale Pruitt, facing his own potential charges for false testimony, cooperated fully with investigators, providing details about the pressure Dawson had placed on him to fabricate his statement. In exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors agreed to a reduced charge, a decision that did not sit easily with everyone in town, but one that Maggie herself did not oppose. "He made a bad choice under pressure," she told Grace when asked her opinion on the matter. "That's different from being the source of the pressure itself. There has to be room in this for people to make things right, not just be punished." Denise Colton was promoted within the department, tasked at her own request with reviewing years of old case files for similar patterns that might have gone unnoticed. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that would never make headlines the way the hearing itself had. But Denise found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she preferred it that way. "My uncle always said the best police work is usually invisible," she told a local reporter during one of the few interviews she agreed to give. "Nobody notices the problems that get caught early. They only notice the ones that get ignored too long." Ruth's Diner, rather than losing its license as Dawson had once threatened, found itself busier than ever, townspeople stopping by not just for coffee but to quietly thank her for a courage many of them wished they had found the words to offer themselves. She kept the badge display a small framed photograph of it hanging near the register, alongside a short, handwritten card. Some promises don't need a uniform to matter. Curtis Whitlock, for his part, avoided most of the attention that followed, uncomfortable with the small burst of local fame his video had briefly brought him. He continued fixing engines, mostly in silence, though he did keep one habit from that week going forward. He kept his phone a little closer just in case the same lesson his father had once taught him, now carrying a little more weight than it used to. 6 weeks after the hearing, on a mild autumn afternoon, Millbrook held a small ceremony outside the county building. It was not a large event, no press beyond the regional paper, no elaborate speeches, just a modest gathering of townspeople standing together on the courthouse lawn, as Judge Marsh presented Maggie with a formal letter of commendation from the state attorney general's office. The autumn light that afternoon fell soft and low across the lawn, the same unhurried gold that had greeted her that first Tuesday morning outside Ruth's Diner, though nobody there that day could have guessed how far it would travel before settling again. The crowd was larger than Maggie had expected. Ruth stood near the front apron, traded for a modest blue dress she had not worn since her husband's funeral, a fact she mentioned to no one, but felt privately the significance of choosing it again for a day like this. Denise stood in uniform, a small silver pin now visible on her collar marking her recent promotion. Beside her stood Officer Griggs, arms crossed, wearing an expression that might on a more expressive man have been called pride. Curtis stood near the back, out of habit more than shyness now, though. He had agreed after some gentle persuading from Ruth to wear a clean shirt for the occasion. Even Corrigan appeared briefly, standing at the edge of the gathering, not close enough to seem presumptuous, not far enough to seem entirely absent. He caught Maggie's eye once, gave a small, uncertain nod, and said nothing. She returned the nod, neither warm nor cold. Some reconciliations, she had learned, did not need words to be acknowledged. Walter Boone stood nearby holding a small wooden display case. When the brief ceremony concluded, he stepped forward and opened it carefully. Inside sat 2 badges, side by side. One tarnished bronze, worn soft with age, engraved simply, "To protect, not to punish." The other, newer, bearing Maggie's own name and title, freshly issued by the state office. "Seemed right," Walter said quietly, "that these 2 should sit together." Maggie ran her fingers gently over her father's badge the same way she had 100 times before, in quieter, harder moments over the past 6 years. "He'd like that," she said softly. "He'd like more than that," Walter said. "He'd like knowing his daughter finished what this town started failing at a long time before you ever rode in on that motorcycle." He paused, glancing out over the small crowd gathered on the lawn. "Town's not perfect," he added. "Never was, never will be, but I think maybe it remembered something today it had started to forget. That doing right by people costs something, and it's worth paying anyway." He looked down at the 2 badges one more time before closing the case gently. "Suppose that's the only inheritance worth passing down in the end? Not land, not money, just the willingness to keep a promise nobody's forcing you to keep." Judge Marsh, standing nearby, added her own brief remarks to the small crowd. "I've served this county for 11 years, she said. "I've seen plenty of hearings come and go. Few have taught me as much as this one did about the cost of looking away and the value of people who refuse to." She turned toward Maggie. "This town owes you a debt it can't fully repay. But I hope this small gesture today is at least a start." The display case was placed permanently in a small glass cabinet near the entrance of the county building, a modest but visible reminder for anyone walking through those doors in the years to come. A small brass plate beneath the case, added at Ruth's quiet insistence and paid for out of the diner's own modest funds, read simply, "For every promise this town almost forgot to keep." Ruth stood nearby, watching the ceremony with tears she did not bother to hide. Frank Delaney stood beside her, cap in hand, the same steady patience in his eyes that had carried him through decades of quiet mornings by the flagpole. "Told you," he said quietly. "Truth's got a way of outlasting gossip. Just takes its sweet time getting there sometimes." "You did tell me that," Ruth said, wiping her eyes. "Learned it the hard way a long time ago," Frank said. "Good to see this town finally learning it too." As the small crowd began to disperse, Maggie walked slowly toward her motorcycle, freshly returned from the impound lot, engine gleaming under Curtis's careful attention over the past several weeks. She swung one leg over, settling into the seat, feeling the familiar, steady weight of the machine beneath her. Denise approached one last time before she left, offering a quiet, sincere smile. "Will we see you around Millbrook again?" "I think so," Maggie said. "This town's earned a little more of my time than I expected to give it." "Good," Denise said. "It could use more people like you around." "It already has them," Maggie said, glancing toward Ruth, toward Walter, toward Frank, still standing quietly by the courthouse steps. "It just needed a reason to remember that." She pulled on her helmet, kicked the engine to life, and rode slowly down Main Street one final time that autumn afternoon, past the diner, past the hardware store, past the flagpole where Frank Delaney would return again tomorrow morning at exactly 7:15, the same as he had every morning for decades. The town watched her go, not with the wary silence of 6 weeks earlier, but with something closer to quiet respect. Some stories end with punishment delivered and nothing more. This one, if it teaches anything worth carrying forward, teaches something a little different. That dignity, once taken, can be returned, but only through the patient, unglamorous courage of ordinary people willing to stand up when it costs them something real. That the loudest voice in the room is rarely the strongest one in it. That justice, more often than not, is not a single dramatic moment, but the slow, quiet accumulation of small, honest choices made by people who will never see their names in any headline. A diner owner who chose truth over fear. A young officer who chose to keep watching even when watching was uncomfortable. A mechanic who kept something ready just in case. An old man who remembered a promise made decades earlier and refused to let it be forgotten. And a woman who carried her father's badge quietly through 10 difficult days, not because she needed the world to see her strength, but because some promises are worth keeping, whether anyone is watching or not.
To protect, not to punish.
6 words passed from father to daughter, now resting safely behind glass in a small county building in a small town, in the kind of place easy to overlook from the highway. But not, as it turned out, so easy to overlook after all. If there is a lesson worth carrying home from a town like Millbrook, it may be this. Most of us will never stand in a hearing room facing down a badge that has forgotten what it was meant to protect. But most of us will at some point face a smaller version of that same choice. A moment where speaking the truth costs something real, and staying quiet feels, at least for a while, like the safer road to take. Ruth Callahan chose truth, knowing it might cost her a diner she had spent 40 years building. Denise Colton chose truth, knowing it might cost her a career she had only just begun. Curtis Whitlock chose to keep something ready, just in case, never expecting it would matter as much as it did. Walter Boone chose to make a handful of quiet phone calls decades after he had any obligation left to make them. None of them set out to be heroes. That word would have embarrassed every one of them if you tried to use it to their faces. They simply refused, each in their own way, to let comfort outweigh conscience when the moment finally asked them to choose. That, perhaps, is the truest kind of courage there is. Not the loud, cinematic kind, but the quiet, everyday kind, practiced by ordinary people who never expected anyone to be watching. Somewhere out on the highway that afternoon, past the edge of town, an old motorcycle engine faded slowly into the distance, carrying a woman and a badge and a promise toward whatever came next. Millbrook behind her kept going, the way small towns do. Slow mornings, church bells at 6, a flagpole raised every day at 7:15 by a man who had never once missed the sunrise and likely never would. But it was in every way that mattered a different town than the one she had ridden into on a quiet Tuesday morning nearly 2 months earlier. Sometimes that is the only kind of victory a story like this can offer. Not a town made perfect, just a town gently, permanently reminded of who it still had the chance to become. There is one more thing worth saying for anyone who has sat with this story long enough to wonder what became of the smaller moments along the way. The impound lot behind the station where the old Triumph once sat waiting under a single security light has been quiet again for months now. But Walter Boone still stops by that lot sometimes on slow afternoons just to make sure everything in this town stays the way it ought to be. Some habits, it turns out, never fully retire. They just wait for the next person worth watching over. And somewhere down that same quiet highway, past the edge of a town most people would only ever pass through, a woman rode on toward whatever came next, carrying a badge that had finally been allowed to mean exactly what it always said it did.